On Thursday nights during the fall academic semester this past year, I made a journey from my seminary office down to the Metuchen Diocese to teach permanent deacon candidates a course on liturgy. And a couple of weeks ago, I arrived early to class, and so I went to a local diner to have dinner. And while I was sitting and eating, a woman came up to me, a stranger, someone I didn't know, and she asked me if I was a priest. She said she saw the lapel cross pin that I wear on my jacket. I said, no, I wasn't a priest, I was a deacon. And she stopped for a moment. She kind of leaned forward over the table, put her hands on her hips and said, well, I guess that'll just have to do. And then she began to tell me about her struggle and lack of joy during the Advent season. And she began to ask me all sorts of questions, and I had this feeling that she was using me as some sort of a travel information center. And I was, answering her questions about how I find joy in my life during Advent. And I assured her that God was in our midst and that we can find joy and happiness even during the darkest moments of our life. She thanked me, and then she asked me to pray for her. And I told her I would, and I have. Today is the third Sunday in Advent, and it's all about joy and rejoicing. Also known as Gaudete Sunday, Gaudete is the Latin word for rejoice. It's why we wear these pink vestments today. And I know some people have mentioned that maybe the church should rename this Pink Sunday. We've passed our midpoint of our Advent journey of solemn preparation. And now we kind of hit the pause button and we take a break. And as we eagerly await the birth of Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem. Many of us during this Advent season go to office parties, we spend time with family and friends, we trim the Christmas tree, and perhaps we even go to the mall to shop for presents and for gifts. And these are all great things to do. But our joy and our happiness can be fleeting as we battle those long lines at the mall, or we seek to fill all those obligations during this time of year. And it can leave us feeling exhausted, overwhelmed in our Advent journey, much like that woman I spoke with that Thursday night. And we can forget the reason for the season. But Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, reminds us why we rejoice this third Sunday of Advent. Written while he was suffering in prison, he implores us to rejoice in the Lord always. And then he goes on to write, your kindness should be known to all, for the Lord is near. Today we rejoice in God's magnificent gift to us, a gift that was born in a manger and comes into our hearts. For Paul and for us, it's not pleasure, power, possessions, or the success of this world that gives us joy and happiness. These are all just transitory. Our true joy and happiness comes from the gift of salvation, God's Son, born in Bethlehem, who died on the cross for us. This brings hope and light to the world. Our Advent joy springs forth and becomes a beacon of light when we reach out in kindness to others. In our gospel passage today, the people asked John the Baptist what they should do in order to reform their lives and obtain salvation. Now, John doesn't tell them to do anything extraordinary or spectacular. Rather, he tells them to live lives of caring and concern, especially for those who are less fortunate. Good advice for us 2,000 years later. Perhaps we can go visit that lonely neighbor next door. Or maybe we can invite that struggling coworker to a cup of coffee. We can make a telephone call that we've been intending to the family member or to a friend, or maybe donate some food and clothing to the less fortunate. Or maybe, as it was in my case, spending a few minutes with a stranger who is struggling during our Advent journey. That night, after class, my heart was heavy as I journeyed northward to Connecticut to be with my mom, who was having a surgical procedure the next morning. And as I traveled along, I listened to Christmas music on the radio. And a song came on that described the journey that Mary and Joseph made to Bethlehem before Jesus was born, called Not That Far from Bethlehem. Maybe you've heard that song. And as I listened to it, I began to imagine Mary and Joseph making that long journey that was very dangerous, on foot and by donkey, 90 miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem. How difficult that must have been. And then it occurred to me that each of us is on our own journey to Bethlehem. You see, it's not just a place on a map. It's where Jesus entered our world and where he comes into the crossroads of our hearts, where hope was born. And this gives us great joy and happiness. Today, as we journey forth to receive the Eucharist, God's gift to us, let us keep our sights on Bethlehem. It is our Advent destination. The lyrics of that song were so simple and yet very beautiful, and I think they were God's words speaking to us, to you and me, as he travels with us on our Advent journey. The song certainly lifted my spirits, and it goes in part, though it seems the road is long, we're not that far from Bethlehem, where all our hope and joy begins. We're not that far from Bethlehem. May God bless you on your Advent journey this week.